let people in if they show up. Hi, Liz. Okay. Hi, Sally. So as I said, let's try to terminate the Neanderthals today. This will hopefully be our last lecture, aiming at mortuary practices, transitional industries, and the denouement of Neanderthals. So mortuary practices. So you got to remember that modern humans have done all kinds of interesting things to their dead, not only including what we classically think of as burials, but mummification, embalming, throwing skeletons in pits, cannibalism, eating brains, sky burials, cremation, graveyards, turning of the bone, burials, Viking death ships, coffins hung from cliffs. So all kinds of interesting practices, just as we'll see, perhaps Neanderthal did similarly. Even for the mostly complete bodies, it's extremely difficult to prove that they were intentionally left at a particular place. Numerous reasons could lead to individual Neanderthals taking their last breaths in a cave, succumbing to sickness, injuries, even starvation or violence. The problem comes with using a kind of inflexible tick list on how the remains of the dead should have been treated, which may overlook otherwise meaningful actions taken by the living. Burials aren't the gold standard, they're simply the most obvious. There's also a spectrum of it. There are lots of ways bodies can be dealt with most also being looked for, being exposed, cut up, burned, curated, displayed, recycled, even eaten have been methodologies. Kabara 2 in Israel has a largely complete Neanderthal's upper body. It's a beautiful skeleton that was preserved from Israel. And in the burial site, you can see the small finger and wrist bone that fell into the empty stomach cavity as it decomposed. Any site with even a partially complete Neanderthal skeleton is a signal for something singular going on. In general, it's vanishingly rare to find an entire body skeleton in a cave, basically. And currently, with modern forensic taphonomy, the study of how bodies decompose, etc., is vital to addressing and how any particular Neanderthal skeleton is. So one tick list for a burial that's been proposed is pits should be artificial, filled by one sediment deposit, very different to the surrounding level. Skeletons should lie complete at the very base of the pit, preferably in an extended or a flexed position, and any associated object should be unusual. Fulfilling these exacting characteristics certainly gives confidence for a deliberate burial, yet they're so stringent that even some historical human cases would be rejected using them. These conditions are met by few Neanderthal fossil sites. One study recognizes only about 35 Eurasian Neanderthal burials. So on this topic, it's pretty clear that Neanderthals intentionally buried their dead, at least in some circumstances. And They included simple grave goods like an animal bone or stone tool. They did not just dump their dead with the rest of the trash to be picked over by the hyenas. Bodies of their dead are often in a flexed position. The most convincing evidence for deliberately excavated burial pits comes from the French sites at La Chapelle, La Forestier, and Roque de Marsal and Saint Césaire, from the Ukrainian site of Kiki Koba, and from Kabara and Amud in Israel. There's a infant skeleton in Syria, and the Shanidar cave in Iraq we'll talk about, because there's even a new skeleton that's been recently discovered there we'll talk about. But even in the best cases, it's not clear whether this represents eschatology, belief in an afterlife, or housekeeping, basically. Some older authors regard Neanderthal burials as evidence of Neanderthal religion, but that's highly speculative. Others see them just as expedient for covering up a stinking corpse, basically. Neanderthal burials are simple affairs, rarely contain evidence of grave goods, and at that, simple ones. But this is also absolutely true for early Homo sapiens graves in Western Asia as well. There are some interesting comparisons to the early Homo sapiens entrance into Eurasia at the same time that Neanderthals were disappearing, which we'll talk about. It appears that Neanderthals had an interest in mortality. They took bodies apart, they ate them occasionally. If you think of what bonobos and elephants do in terms of touching the dead, carrying dead babies for days, these were not accidental burials. The Amud child in Israel had a single deer jaw or a grave good. There are no instances where Neanderthal skeletons are accompanied by significant numbers of grave goods, like the much later modern human burials. That was different. This is the Amud site. It was an infant lying close to a cave wall with a deer jaw on its pelvis. Some of the burials include children, even the original 1856 Feldhofer. They were found skull piece and then pieces of two others. Cima de los Huesos has 28 skeletons in a pit. Krapina has more than 900 bones, estimated anywhere from 20-ish to 80 individuals. La Quina has 20. La Hortus in France has, up in the middle of a 300-foot cliff, a collection over centuries. And again, Cima de los Palmos has 10 Neanderthals over centuries. Le Forestier, 8 individuals at what was clearly a living site. There are parts of many children. And Shanidar has 11 Neanderthals, and we'll talk more about that. And then there are orphan skulls in a number of places. So intentionally buried some of their dead. The big question is why? Was it some kind of ritual or practical purpose, hygiene? Usually they're shallow graves, and there are at least 35 known Neanderthal grave sites. In 16 of 20 of them, bodies are tightly flexed near fetal position. But the question is this a burial ritual, or simply it produces the smallest grave to be dug? No evidence that Neanderthals practiced ritual in their burials in terms of evidence. A little bit about Shanidar. They're undergoing a new modern re-excavation of this site led by the British paleontologist Graham Barker. And this is the cave site. It was used for centuries by herders during the winter, and during the spring, all kinds of flowers. In the summer, pretty dry. Ralph Selecki, an American anthropologist, did excavations in the 50s, basically, where they dug a trench in the middle of the cave site, and 14-meter rectangular trench. And basically they dug down to the limits of radiocarbon dating of the 1950s and ended up finding the bones of 10 Neanderthal. There were modern human artifacts above them. And the famous book that came out was titled Shenandoah, the First Flower People, in reference to what the famous flower hypothesis of the way one of them was buried. And Eric Trinkhaus also did a book on this group. So the 2023 data now has gone down another 10 meters to 85,000 years ago. So that's an ongoing project that is using totally modern excavation techniques, basically, including modern C14 and luminescence dating, micromorphology, environmental DNA, sorting everything down to 2 millimeters, basically. So this is a real modern update. And in his, he just died 4 years ago at the age of 101, and kept many, many diaries. And basically he found 10 Neanderthal men, women, and children, and his subsequent discussion of how they lived and died did much to change our perception of Neanderthals in general. He humanized them, basically. And most famously, he argued that Shenandoah 4 skeleton had been buried with flowers based on pollen work by Arlette Leroy Ron, the most famous pollen scientists of the period. Argued that Shenandoah 1 skeleton provides evidence for compassion and an initial intentional burial, and that the flower burial did much to sort of change our perception, basically. This is the layout of the pit they did and the where they found each of the Neanderthals. His theories have been controversial since the point of making them in the 50s. Lots of debates about his ultimate conjecture that Shenandoah 3 had a puncture wound and has been considered one of the first murders in the hominin data that we have, because there's a rib that has what looks like either a spear mark or an arrow mark. Some could consider it modern human violence toward Neanderthals. Some have thought of it as a spear effect. It's debated. This is the way the layout looked and where some of the major Neanderthals were basically found. And there are no modern human bones above them, but single-use hearths during warm period and upper Paleolithic stone tools of modern humans are found above the Neanderthal layers. There was, yes.
Didn't you say that there was something like a 10,000-year gap between the Neanderthal remains and the modern human remains? Or was that something else?
Can't quite remember. Okay, I'll have
Okay.
to think
Because
on this.
it seems
Yeah,
unlikely that a Neanderthal would have been murdered by a modern human if
right.
there's no evidence that they were
Yeah,
there.
good point. Good point. Yeah. Um, One of the things they did was that they encapsulated some of the fossil in a plaster box, Shenandoah 4, and then drove it on top of a taxi to Baghdad, several hundred miles away. Of course, this was 1950, and as a consequence, the whole structure did not hold, and it collapsed and made for massive interpretation issues, as we'll see in a second. Okay, um, uh, that's pretty much what Lee Berger did with the recent stuff that I've talked about. Uh, and basically, there was at least one Neanderthal skeleton in it, basically. And Eric Trinkhaus then um, uh, speculatively put together what was in that plaster cast of the findings into one major body and parts of three others, basically, in terms of the remains in that plaster box. The bones did not fit Shenandoah 4, then those became the other three. But new findings sort of make this somewhat problematic. Okay. The big news is that they have found an entirely new skeleton that they've labeled Shenandoah 7. And it was directly adjacent to where Shenandoah 4 was. And they think that the bottom half of Shenandoah Z was in the plaster case. Okay, so things got really mixed up in the process. This is the new top half of Shenandoah Z. So basically teeth, eye socket, cranium, etc. So flattened pizza, basically. And they think this is how he was laid out in the burial, basically, with the remains of ribs and hands, etc. So the latest burial that we basically have, and it's for Neanderthal burials, almost as nice as the Kabara. Not quite as nice, but a very interesting layout. And again, Shenandoah 4 may have some of Shenandoah Z's lower skeleton, basically, because they only found the top half of the new guy. And they absolutely conclude that they think shoveling was happening in burying Shenandoah Z, that it was truly an intentional burial, basically. And interestingly, there's a rock wall that a whole number of these were stacked at. So these were done not at the same period, basically, so, but stacking of some burials, which was interesting in itself and still not well understood. And Paul Petit wrote The Paleolithic Origins of Human Burial, and his comment was La Hortus, La Quina, La Faracier, Crepina, and Shenandoah imply the transmission of mortuary tradition centered around a fixed point in the landscape that could be used, not exclusively, to hide, process, and bury the dead. To the groups at La Faracier and Shenandoah, the dead had not quite departed. They were with them. So a persistent place, basically. They're doing environmental dirt DNA that is being evaluated by the Danish SK Bilderslev. And there'll be multiple publications basically coming out of this eventually. And Shenandoah Cave is a national monument, basically in Kurdistan today, and still visited as a major tourist site. And this raises one of the historical questions about, was this one of the way the pollen got into the place? There was Selecki thought that a rock fall may have buried them, but that's been disproved basically, that they think these were deliberate burials basically. And they're continuing to reassess all of this. The question of the flower burial has brought up numerous hypotheses basically. Originally, they thought it was flower pollen found with Shenandoah 4, but there are also animal burrows all over the site basically, including the Neanderthal layers. Theories have included flowers laid on the body, plants covering the bodies, flowers brought in on the feet of tourists today, as well as Selecki's team and the original Neanderthals, as well as Goebbels introducing the pollen, okay? That was my theory for a long time. But the original 1960s Leroy-Laurent hypothesis considered all of these and still concluded that the pollen was a flower burial. And even the current leader of the new expedition still sort of leans in that direction. But new published study, these are some of the flowers, and some of the pollen that's in the layers comes basically from different seasons of flowers. That's been modernly proved, okay, which means that they may not have all been done at the same time, or whatever introduced them didn't happen at once, basically. So the new article is entitled Shenandoah and its Flowers, basically. Originally, they sent 6 soil samples to the pollen specialist in the 1950s, who was the one that concluded that it was flowers. But they're also woody tissue of juniper pine, so remember that for a moment. So the new study basically, I think, disproves the idea that it was Neanderthals who did the flowers, basically. And I'll show the Wednesday group. Remember the fact, in case you don't know it, that 85% of all bees burrow into the soil and live there. 85%. Okay, even though they fly around a lot, their hives are underground. Okay, and basically in the new study, this is one of the examples of them doing it in this cave floor over the millennia, basically. The new study discounts the possibility that Selecki and his colleagues introduced the pollen, and that the pollen is likely to be approximately contemporary with the Neanderthals with which it's associated, but it discounts that the Neanderthals did the flowers, and they conclude that basically it was bees who introduced the pollen into the grave sites. Okay, so that's the most recent hypothesis about how the pollen, which is actually there, got there, basically. And that they weren't laid down, the flowers were from different periods of their blossoming as well. So they weren't, which is on the side that the bees were doing it, not the humans in a one-time event, basically. And the bees are still common today and still burrowing. there, basically. So an interesting new theory. They leave the question about why are there wood fragments in the burial sites, including the Shenandoah Z, and they're now theorizing that they probably were laying leaf branches over the bodies and under the bodies, and that may have been part of whatever ritual they were doing. So that's a newer idea that hasn't been much talked about. But that's the Shenandoah. Also, as I mentioned, that there's some new speculation about the Neanderthals using topography in terms of their burying, because some of these were kind of stacked burials. So that's another new interesting thing to try to explain. Lavoisier in France at 70K, there are 2 adults and 4 children. Basically, the speculation has been that this was a family burial site, but that's still a speculation. Rebecca Ragg-Sykes, the newest Neanderthal book, Kindred, speculates that Neanderthals had a big interest in taking bodies apart and did all kinds of interesting, strange things, just as the modern humans have done interesting, strange things with dead bodies, basically. There's been a re-excavation of the La Chapelle site, as well as the Shenandoah. And this coming section is heavily based on Rebecca's thinking, but whole skeletons are extraordinarily uncommon and virtually unknown for big creatures, except for bears who die in hibernation kind of situation. Looking at Neanderthal burials show just how complicated things are. Many were excavated decades ago with not good practices, basically, good for their times, but not modern. The most famous cold case is probably La Mostier, where they found an adolescent as well as an infant burial. The most complete skeleton was found, the old man of La Chapelle Sans, which Boole did his famous first monograph, which totally distorted what Neanderthals looked like, because he sort of discounted the fact this was a severely arthritic older Neanderthal and made him into the famous 1909 painting of sort of gorilla looking Neanderthal that basically left the negative image for the next 100 years, basically. But this was actually a very intact body with lots of physical features that he actually got correct but misinterpreted, basically. And this is La Malonga cave in Italy. It's a beautifully preserved skeleton that is now totally covered and encased in calcite. It's not clear that it was a burial or whether this guy actually just fell into a pit, but a very beautiful body. We can't be sure that Neanderthal remains at open air locales were intentionally manipulated, but recent research has found that other things than burials were happening with bodies in caves and rock shelters. Cases of unquestionably butchered Neanderthal bones are being identified, including, interestingly, the 1856 skeleton as well. Neanderthals were covering the full range of what they did with animals, with Neanderthal skeletons, skinning them, dismembering, jointing, defleshing. their own people, and comprehensively snapping and smashing bones like at Krapina. All of the parts of the skeleton across multiple individuals were processed, skinning, defleshing, even the skulls were done. Krapina is basically made up of incredibly small pieces of bone, basically. There are theories that it may have been a whole burial site, etc. So lots of complex mortuary behavior in Neanderthals, including cannibalism, clearly even hypothesized in 1906 by Gramberger. They were taking bodies apart, fragmenting them, sometimes using them for tools. Even one retoucher was made out of a Neanderthal skull, which is absolutely unique in the whole hominin skeletal finds. Basically, no other example of a skull bone being reused as a retoucher. So not all Neanderthal sites with human remains preserve the evidence of burial. Some hint at very different, potentially darker ways of dealing with the dead. They bear cut marks and other evidence of post-mortem processing, basically, at multiple sites, basically. And it's unclear whether this should kind of count as either symbolic behavior or subsistence activity. Some may have been nutritional cannibalism, lots may not. Tim White thinks hunger, cannibalism type, nutritional. The Lemonstier teenager was butchered, his skull was skinned, defleshed, tongue removed, jaw cut off, sliced, possibly battered, and the meat from one femur was also removed. His body hadn't been left scattered, and the skull and lower jaw were actually next to each other. Though separated by tens of millennia, Krapina and Lemonstier are later Neanderthal sites, and it's during this period, about 130K, that body processing seems to be, if not uncommon, no longer very rare. And in many contexts, there's little difference in how the hominin and the faunal remains were treated, with similar focus on getting at marrow-rich body parts, basically. So direct proof Neanderthals were actually eating the processed bodies is scarce. Tooth marks aren't common on animal bones, so those on hominin remains are especially noteworthy. At least one leg shaft from Krapina has shallow paired grooves, looking exactly as if someone had gnawed on it like a corn cob, basically. At Vendija, the evidence strongly suggests Neanderthal bones are treated and processed in much the same way as animal remains at the site. At Goyer in Belgium, the bones were used as stone tool retouchers. At Krapina, processed again much in the same way that the non-human remains there as well. Russell argued that Krapina was a reburial site, basically, involving bone cleaning and then leaving that left cut marks, basically. And one famous Italian site, Monte Circio, the skull there was originally described as a religious ritual, has now been clearly reinterpreted as a hyena activity, not hominin. Okay, so sometimes hard to interpret some of this stuff. So in terms of burial stats, the early middle Paleolithic, there are no burials. You never find graves. The middle Paleolithic itself, 2/3 male, many infant and children, almost no adolescents. By the Neolithic, you've got 2/3 female and a whole number of them buried in houses. So rituals clearly change, and grave goods only show up in the middle upper Paleolithic in terms of lots of amounts of them, basically, sometimes fabulous jewelry, etc. And Neanderthal teeth have evidence that there were periods of severe starvation weren't uncommon. So we know, in terms of the history in Europe, at least, of multiple climate-related loss of groups and then recolonizations, etc. They clearly occasionally practice cannibalism. Moulin Gercy in France is a classic example, with butchery marks indicating defleshing and marrow extraction. And the occasionally, when you find that the butchery marks are identical on the Neanderthal bones and on the deer fauna at the site, it's clearly being consumed for food. And during periods of starvation, that may have been part of what happened. But tooth marks, as I said, are extremely rare. And the burning of human remains is also very rare. So if they were eating them, they were eating them raw. Krapina has some burning and suggesting that some of the dead were cooked, basically. If we assume at least some cannibalism was happening, the question is why? Nutritionally rich bones don't appear to have been selected for processing at Krapina. At El Cedron in Spain, the family group that was found there were probably cannibalized, and they were very intensively processed, basically. Yet despite some bodies having been taken apart, it doesn't look exactly like the typical animal butchery and isn't systematic or targeted to the richest parts of some of the bones. The bones had no carnivore damage or weathering, and some parts were still connected. At El Cedron, the representation is strange. Facial bones are mostly missing. There's a hyoid, and toes are oddly numerous, but there's one pattern across all the bodies. It's the youngsters who have the most cut marks, which is hard to explain if this is solely about nutrition. Okay, why eat the smallest when the bigger guys were around? For any species living in small groups at low population densities, regularly eating each other is a highway to extinction. And compared to animals of roughly equal size, hominid bodies are surprisingly nutritionally poor. So could it have been starvation? And some other sites like Le Pradel in France, most certainly it was a Quenya cold spell reindeer hunting camp, but evidence shows it was dramatically colder. It wasn't dramatically colder than Wales or Scotland today. So among the butchered animals, there also remains of at least 9 processed Neanderthals as well. They include adults and children, were treated nearly the same way as the reindeer. Been claimed as another case of nutritional cannibalism, but that doesn't quite stack up, because it not only was it not extremely cold at the time, there were immense amounts of butchered reindeer. Food wasn't an issue, so why were these Neanderthals chopped up? Okay, so something else was going on, and it's not totally clear what that was in terms of some kind of ritual processing, potentially. So interglacial body processing sites have been argued to result from starving Neanderthals being unused to hunting forest creatures, is one hypothesis. Another cannibalism site contemporary with Krapina is Moulin Gercy in France. Half of the remains from 6 Neanderthals were butchered. The processing was quite extensive, smashed bones, defleshed, etc. There are arguments against climate-driven interglacial famines and cannibalism. Remember that Newmark Nord, with its 70 elephants, it's clear that Neanderthals had adapted to forest hunting. Huge elephants were being targeted, and that this was during a heat wave, actually. Rather than being connected to particular climates, might cannibalism simply imply Neanderthals were ruthlessly chomping down on their weaker individuals or their quote enemies. Children and elders would be most at risk, but they don't outnumber the butchered teenagers and adults. Plus, one guy at Molagursi was among the largest ever known Neanderthals, not likely to be attacked easily. Antagonism towards strangers could be another explanation. At Goyer, it's been proposed that aggression-motivated cannibalism occurred. Huge amounts of bone cracking points to consumption. Theory that these were foreigners has not been upheld. Basically, that these were there are indications that these were local types, basically. And butchered bodies don't seem to have higher rates of violent deaths. The collaboration and food sharing at the heart of Neanderthal society kind of argues against this. They may well have had primal motivations, but not necessarily rooted in belligerence, basically. Kind of demonstrates two things in understanding Neanderthal cannibalism and body processing. There's no need to invoke aggression as a default. Second, after consumption, the dismantled scrapes aren't transformed into waste, but still treated as representative of the dead and kept. Cannibalism is very probably a powerful means by which individuals and group process the impact not only of killings carried out on emotional impulses, but other deaths too. And in other words, Rag Sykes think it was potentially a part of grieving process in terms of all of this bone processing that was going on. So suddenly it's not difficult to envisage how skills in carefully taking apart hunted carcasses might have been transposed into a grieving process that involved butchery and cannibalism as acts of intimacy, not necessarily violation. As they increasingly scrutinized faunal bone collections for worked objects, including retouchers, examples made from Neanderthal remains have been discovered. At Krapina and at Goyer in Belgium, retouchers have been made from Neanderthal parts. Usually they tend to use much stronger bison bones for retouchers, but here they were using their own. And it's very clear Neanderthals were exceptionally knowledgeable about anatomy, basically in terms of their animal butchery. And the Akrapina, as I mentioned, the skull retoucher was created despite its unusability in terms of not being a particularly strong bone in comparison to the bison. Then there's a skull that at Krapina, where some Neanderthal did 30 perfectly parallel lines on the skull. Okay, so this is clearly in an engraving, and what it symbolized is unclear, but they were doing something special with this skull, totally all the way across. So this was an engraving event, basically. Another interesting point is almost no female skeletons. Okay, so I haven't seen any good speculation as to why, okay, except that remember the modern human there was a shift from male skeletons to female skeletons at one point, and maybe Neanderthals didn't get to that point, but it's mainly youngsters, and almost everybody is male from what they can tell. And they're children in multiple body deposits, basically. And in the Near East, while there are plenty of skeletons, there are no known cases of body processing. So body processing seems to be a European phenomena, as opposed to in Israel, where there have been lots of Neanderthals. And interesting, the Lavoisier teenager was butchered, but the baby was not. And plenty of locales with rich Neanderthal archaeology have no known Neanderthal skeleton or skeletal parts, basically. Conspicuous is Abrec Romani in Spain, where it was occupied for tens of thousands of years, basically. And none of the hundreds of thousands of bones there are hominin. So this was not used as a grave site. And in essence, it's now very hard to maintain that Neanderthal bones all accumulated by random processes, or in the case of butchery, that it was just about filling hungry stomachs. Once the breadth of mortuary practice is understood, the borders between what they and early Homo sapiens did with the dead begins to look very fuzzy. But there remains differences. There are no intact Neanderthal skeletons come from open air sites, though they're also rare among Homo sapiens until after 30K, 10,000 years after Neanderthal disappears, when spectacular burials begin to show up. And again, spectacular grave goods are found only in Homo sapiens. It was not part of Neanderthal behavior at the point when they vanished. Note that Africa has only 2 burial sites that are older than 70K. So it says something about the rarity of these events in human history, basically, early on. So a major conclusion to draw from all this is that if mortuary traditions extend beyond our own species and even back to our last common ancestor with Neanderthal, then so too does a key definition of humanity. No formalized spiritual framework was needed. Neanderthal funerals probably ranged from ardent and anarchic to methodological and precise. Rag Sykes says they too were motivated not only by fear, but also by love. So just like us. Transitional industries. This term references where you find stratigraphic layers in caves where you find different types of stone tools representing different species. Okay, so you can have classically, you will find layers of Mousterian lithics in the Neanderthal layers, and then above them you will find African Homo sapiens layers with upper Paleolithic lithics, basically. Transitional references the rare sites where there's a middle layer in between those two. Okay, so that's what transitional industries references. Tom Hyman, who's got his own book, which is a good read, from 2014, made his name because in 2014 he used modern C14 techniques using improved mass spectrometry to relook at 40 key Mousterian Neanderthal archaeological sites ranging from Russia to Spain trying to get a better date as to when they disappeared. And basically what he found was that Mousterian lithics ended by 41 to 39,000 years ago across Europe. So 41 to 39 is the date for the disappearance of the morphological form of Neanderthal. And that succeeding transitional archaeological industries, one of which has been linked with Neanderthals, the Châtel-Perronian, end at the same time, basically. So disappearance of Neanderthals occurred at different times in different regions. He estimates that there was an overlap of modern human and Neanderthals of between 2,600 and 5,400 years. So he thinks that's the period, but 25 to 5,000 years where the two intermingled, basically. That was ample time for transmission of cultural, symbolic behaviors, as well as possible genetic exchange between the two groups. These stratigraphic layers containing Neanderthals, Mousterian lithic tools also disappear between 45 and 40K. What tools come afterwards has caused probably the most vexed of all Neanderthal debates, basically, the Châtel-Perronian debate, basically. So post 40K, there's many more Neanderthal-shaped, modern human-shaped bone, antler, ivory objects, far more than you find in the earlier Neanderthal periods. But Neanderthals knew how to make blades and bladelets, but they simply never did much of it for unknown reasons, basically. And formed bone artifacts are very rare in Mousterian layers, basically. And middle Paleolithic lithics are always below the intermediate ones, which are then followed by upper Paleolithic layers after 40K. The earliest modern humans, African Homo sapiens in Eastern Europe, arrived by around 45K. There were some earlier ones, but the vast majority showed up after 45K. Neanderthals disappear by 40K. The transitional period is considered to be 40 to 45. And there's been continued debate about the origin of these transitional tool traditions, basically. Originally, there was a claim that Neanderthals simply didn't carve bones and pendants, etc., and that's clearly been disproved. Châtel-Perronian, France, northern Iberia, and among the most famous are Saint-Césaire and the Grotto du René in France, basically. And I'll go and simply show you. So these are retouchers that were found, basically. And we absolutely know that Neanderthals probably invented retouchers, and modern humans probably took them over from them. But there's much older evidence for Neanderthals and retouchers than modern humans. But the Châtel-Perron at René are these, basically. Okay, there are teeth that are scored. There are lots of thin bladelets, and interestingly, some eagle talons. Okay, we'll comment about that. But lots of what look like tying for bare teeth, etc., are included in these layerings. And the big question has been, were these made by Neanderthals? And this has been a 20-year debate, basically. And the teeth represent a variety of animals, basically, in these layers. And some having holes drilled into them. Originally, the argument, of course, were that Neanderthals were idiots and couldn't have possibly created any of this stuff. And that's clearly been disproved. But the question is, who done it, basically? And more examples. So whether these were necklaces, they've been recommissioned here as though they were. So the debate as to whether the last Neanderthals or modern humans created the tools and jewelry at Rennes, based on the long assumptions that Neanderthals were incapable of producing upper Paleolithic type tools. In 2016, proteomics was used and showed that identified Neanderthals as being in the layer with these upper Paleolithic looking tools, okay? So that pushed aside that these were definitely Neanderthal, okay? And the necklaces are tiny beads of animal teeth, shells, ivory, sometimes no more than a centimeter long, and accompanied by delicate bone tools, same layers as fossils from Neanderthals. The big argument here is stratigraphy. And remember, we think of layers as being flat layers. And so imagine a series of 10, 20, 30 flat layers, okay? The problem is that with age, there's sediment pressure that can potentially push up or down or intrusively. You can get an area that basically has a vertical column dismantling 5, 6, 10 layers, basically, and mixing up everything that was in all of them. So that's the problem, basically, was are the findings that they were Neanderthal basically that the stratigraphy simply got mixed up, and what ended up in a Neanderthal layer actually came from upper Paleolithic layer above it that had been pushed down by sediment pressure or sediment flow in the cave, etc. So that's been the horrific problem with all of this, basically. And there are 5 other transitional groups in Europe, basically, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Bulgaria, all with different names, basically. And the $1 million question is, who made them, basically? So 2 competing explanations. One, the CP was actually an independent Neanderthal invention that had upper Paleolithic-like features by chance. Or alternatively, it was made by Neanderthals, but resulted from some kind of cultural hybridization, that basically they learned it from modern humans. And today, things have gotten more complicated. There are almost 100 CP sites are now known, from Paris to Iberia, between 44 and 41K. And it was definitely over fast everywhere, the last perhaps 1 millennium in any site, basically, that lasted. And the excavations of new sites without any layer problems have revealed a very different cultural picture. Middle Paleolithic flakes and tools are only present in CP assemblages from old excavation sites, places where there were signs of disturbances. Detailed studies of the newer clean CP layers show it was a truly upper Paleolithic world, that it was not created by Neanderthals, basically. And currently, and you even find these in open air sites where there were clear separation. And today, Saint-Césaire and Rene are the only CP sites with Neanderthal associations. And despite the new protein identifications, both locales are very problematic. Rene was excavated 30 years ago, lacked precise location recording and sediment studies. They only have layer and grid square recording, not more specific layering recorded as they do today. And most were toward the bottom of the CP layer, but others came from higher up, which was taken to mean Neanderthals were present through the entire layering, basically. So strongly suggestive that disturbance or sediment movement between the two deposits, basically, denying Neanderthal a role in their creation, basically. And so geothermal processes, freezing sediment, they can move up to 5 feet vertically and can displace everything in either direction. So what's really needed is a whole re-excavation of the Rene and the Saint-Césaire sites, basically using refitting analysis, where you basically, remember, you take a tool, a finished tool, and look around you for every piece of that tool. And if you can find every piece of that tool in the same layer, you know that there hasn't been any mix-up. And that's not been done there, basically. So it's still a puzzle, but it's leaning very heavily against the Neanderthals, basically. Rag Sykes is definitely on the sides that Neanderthals didn't do it, basically, didn't do the CP tool and pendant findings, that these were upper Paleolithic tools, basically, that were found. So we need basically further study to definitively prove that, but that's the way it's leaning. Okay, let's say. Then this year, Ludovic Slimak, who is a French Neanderthal specialist that I only discovered recently, and who is about to publish a new Neanderthal book in early 2024, okay? And he's the one that has been doing the excavation at Mandrin Cave in France, that basically found the layer that's been dated at 54,000 years ago, that is almost certainly a Homo sapiens layer that is between Mousterian below it and Mousterian above it, okay? So that there was a group of Homo sapiens that moved into this area 54,000 years ago, was there for maybe a lifetime, and then disappeared, leaving no further evidence of them or descendants, etc. It's a major study, and it sort of adds a new wrinkle to all of this, particularly because they find these incredibly small, what look like arrowheads. And in fact, many of them with damage that implies that they were used against something, basically. Okay, so these stone nanosites was published just this year, implying bow and arrow technology, okay, which is an amazing claim, basically, because most bow and arrow technology doesn't happen until after 20K in Europe or Africa. All right, so this is a somewhat controversial study, but a very interesting one, okay? So these are the kind of stone heads that were basically found, where they were so little that he claims that they could only have been used as arrowheads that were shot from a bow, basically.
Charlie,
yes.
What about that date? I mean, up till now, you've been talking about humans arriving around 45,000 years ago, and now we've got a 55,000. That's a pretty big gap.
Right. Well, remember, I did that one review in one of my talks where I went through the 15 different known Homo sapiens intrusions into Europe that have genetic data connected to them.
Yeah.
So that there were clearly sapiens moving into Europe occasionally and simply disappearing. That they were there for a short time, never had descendants, and they were simply a migration that lasted for a while and then disappeared, but left some genetics. The earliest one is the Sahel one in Germany from around 200,000 years ago that left mitochondrial DNA in one femur of a Neanderthal, as an example. So it's clearly possible that this is another one of those very short-lived migrations. And even in the article, they basically conclude that this couldn't have lasted more than a lifetime.
Oh, okay.
Right? And
so
then,
we're still shooting for roughly 45,000 as the more permanent group that came and stayed.
Right, that we know of. Well, I'll come to that in just a little bit, okay?
Okay.
So these are some of the objects also that what the technology has been labeled the Neronian in Southeast Asia. There are also some other spots that have it, basically. This is the CP types. This is the Neronian types, basically, with the very small arrowhead-like stone tools. So this is a real interesting mystery that's been now studied, and they've clearly got evidence here of something unusual going on. But they're basically a Quina level, and after, and then you've got this Neronian level, and then 5 more Mosterian levels before the modern human levels start to accumulate. So it's this unique one level, and the level is associated with modern humans via a single tooth that's been genetically shown to be modern human, Homo sapiens. Okay, that's the evidence that this was Homo sapiens. So we need more data, but at least that's the data we have so far, basically. And there are 60,000 objects in this layer with millions of napping debris associated with it. It looks completely unlike anything else during this period in Western Europe. The richness of the assembly is extraordinary. There are 1,300 points systematically made in 3 different sizes. And a third are less than 1 inch long and therefore are microlithic, but others are so diminutive, 0.3 to 0.6 inches long, that they've labeled them as nanopoints. damaged by high-speed impacts, too small to have been used in spears, so likely used in darts or some kind of arrowhead phenomenon. And 75% are laminar production, like upper Paleolithic types, basically. So this is an amazing discovery, and there are no comparable small lithic points for more than 10,000 years later. Comprehensive dating shows that the layer was deposited between 50 and 52K, and soot chronology on the ceilings points to no more than several decades, maybe even a few years that it lasted. So a really interesting discovery. One weird component is clearly there could have been older, as I've indicated, cryptic dispersals of early human sapiens into Western Europe. Alternatively, an ancient hybrid population is a possibility. Unlikely, but who knows? But there's also a glimmer of cultural connection here with the Neanderthals. The Neronian produced one of the largest butchered golden eagle talon collections anywhere in Europe, and only Neanderthals were interested in eagles. Modern humans show no such interest in the upper Paleolithic. All right. So, and these are included in this layer. All right. So, mystery on mystery. Okay. All right. Let's say Rebecca Ragsyke's book, Kindred, absolutely a great read. Read it. Highly recommended if you're interested in Neanderthals. I've stolen massively from her, as you probably know. Amazingly, back in March, I wrote her an email. Kindred is a fantastic book. My only concern is your apparent opinion that the CP material is not Neanderthal. I would like your analysis of the use of proteomics in this study, which appears to conclude that Neanderthals did create the material at this site, Welker, the proteomics study of 2016. Thank you, Charlie. And then in August, last month, I get an email back from her. Thank you for your email and kind words about my book. Apologies for the delay in my response. I think I do go into a lot of detail in the book about my concerns with Grotte de Rene, which is simply that lithic refitting has demonstrated some movement of objects within the CP layer. And therefore, until there's full investigation into stratigraphy, the presence of fossils or DNA in the CP layer must be suspect, as there may have been movement between the layers. That's how she interprets the proteomics simply moved, basically, okay? And were found in a different layer. A new paper was recently published which reports such a fossil, but I think the most important point they make is their conclusion that furthermore, additional analysis must be conducted to discuss the archaeological integrity of the CP sequence, such as what has been done at Saint Césaire. Indeed, it incites to undertake taphonomic and spatial studies of the remains, since it is now the only site delivering human remains in CP layers from which these kinds of studies have not been carried out. And interestingly, the study she cites, of course, is the Slimak Mandarin study as being one to look at in reference to all of this. Okay, so that was Rebecca's reply. The latest dated Neanderthals in Europe are not restricted to southwestern Europe, but are actually rather widely spread in Europe. Neanderthals and their lithic traditions disappear between 41 and 39K. In Iberia, Finlayson there at Gibraltar has maintained for years that that was the last stronghold. But Hyman thinks that the C14 study, that in fact that they're underestimating, and that it was much earlier that they disappeared there. So there's some debate there. So he thinks that the radiocarbon dating in Spain are underestimates. Okay. So Hayam has done the 200 new dates for 40 sites. All of them end up 39 to 41K. And then in Hungary, the Homo sapiens skull of Oase has been dated to 39 to 41K. And he's the Homo sapiens who has a 5 generations of Neanderthal in him, basically. And remember that the earliest European Homo sapiens were not the Orgnathians who came later after 42K. So there's a period of 2,000 to 3,000 years where it turns out that Homo sapiens was being systematically wiped out just at the same time that Neanderthals were being wiped out by something, okay? So nobody was surviving during this period, all right? So it's an interesting timing point. Let's say no evidence yet of modern human DNA in Neanderthals, only Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, okay? Nobody understands why, but that's the data, basically. But there was an overlap. Okay, the denouement. Did Neanderthals go extinct? The answer is yes and no, all right? Genetic data conclusively shows that Neanderthals made small but important genetic contributions to the modern Eurasian gene pools. Also been a very small amount of Neanderthal gene flow in African populations due to movement back into Africa during the last 20,000 years, so that even the San of the Kalahari have 0.03% Neanderthal DNA. So everybody on the planet basically has some Neanderthal DNA, so they are clearly ancestors of ours. But the Neanderthal morphology disappears at 40K, but not their genetics. So some have attributed the disappearance to climate change, but population modeling suggests that rapidly changing climate alone would not have resulted in global extinction unless competition with early humans wasn't part of the picture. Remember, Neanderthals have been in Europe for probably 400,000 to 500,000 years, and they've gone through multiple glaciation, non-glaciation, warming, reglaciation, population demise, population reincursions for 400,000 years, basically. So what happened differently this time, okay, is the question to solve. And there were clear population size differences between the two groups, and demography may be, and probably is, one of the key factors for Neanderthal demise, basically. When did it happen? 39 to 40K. Where did it happen? Interestingly, aside from generic Lavoisier technology, Mousterian, most intriguingly, in China, you find Mousterian artifacts. Okay, so potentially they got as far as China in terms of their technology. So it's not unreasonable to imagine that the last breaths to fill Neanderthal lungs were inhaled somewhere in the vastness of Central or Eastern Asia, but we simply don't know. The modern human oasejaw is among the few fossil representatives for late Neanderthal modern human interbreeding. But that was 6 generations back, basically. And further irony is that longstanding claims that early Homo sapiens possessed some intrinsic superiority have clearly been disproved. I hope I disproved them for you in these lectures. But the Awashimans people went extinct in Europe. The Siberian Ossetion man, his line disappeared. All of the early Eurasian sapiens intrusions around 40 to 45K all went extinct. It was only after 45K or so that we end up having Homo sapiens that leave genetic markers in modern Europeans, basically. So they went as extinct as Neanderthals did. So not a great sign of evolutionary dominance, basically, for Homo sapiens. Our present evidence of interbreeding may be somewhat like the early history of exoplanet discoveries, where such objects were assumed to be rare. 20 years later, that we're finding them in every star system, basically. Today, we know Eurasia was always a melting pot, home to hundreds, perhaps thousands of hybrid children, basically. But both Neanderthals and sapiens in Europe die out around 40K, basically. And sapiens populations before 37K didn't contribute to the modern gene pool, basically. There's no evidence of the earliest modern humans in Europe contributing to the genetic composition of present-day Europeans. Only after 37K does that show up, basically. So there wasn't a wholesale merging of populations or culture. No Neanderthal, excuse me, let Wayne back in. Neanderthals across the whole range during the crucial period between 80 and 40K have any genetic hints of hybridizing Neanderthal DNA, and not all early Homo sapiens show it either. So the genetic patterns in living people tell us a simulation to some degree happened. Neanderthals remain physically distinct even in their last visible skeletal remains. But they were clearly human, okay? Biologically speaking, individuals who can mate and create viable offsprings are the same species. The replacement of Neanderthals probably occurred at different rates in different places over several thousand years, probably. And the possibility that Neanderthals were assimilated into modern human groups is probably increasingly becoming the dominant theory of how they disappeared. So as we've just talked about, from 200K on, there was some commingling on occasion between these two groups. But in terms of breeding populations, Neanderthals were probably more isolated, had smaller groups, and modern humans may have had more and more people around when they started showing up. But we need to see Neanderthals on their own terms, not only from their demise, but their achievements that they were another kind of human with whom we interacted, basically. There have been dozens of demise theories of Neanderthals. Genetic issues, the effect of population genetics, their very low genetic viability, low population sizes, more genetic drift in those kinds of groups. Loss of ecosystem mammals, given the kind of glaciation effects that were happening in Eurasia. Potential competition with modern humans for resources. There's a great article by Vella and Robrooks called Neanderthal Demise and Archaeological Analysis of the Modern Human Superiority Complex. I absolutely urge you to read it, okay? It's one of the great papers in terms of trying to explain the disappearance of Neanderthals and why they weren't very much different than modern humans. But some of the theories include climate change. So there was rapid changes after 120K, but Neanderthals were well experienced with cold, big game ecosystems, and this may have produced losses in terms of their food sources. Repeated population crashes with decreased genetic diversity, low Neanderthal population density, a theory of possible male hybrid sterility in Neanderthals, the contraction in their geographic distribution due to glaciation effects, interbreeding within their small community sizes. Males in small groups were often related, and consequent, that should be inbreeding, followed by genetic swamping and assimilation by modern human population. Okay, so possible ideas. Neanderthals disappear, 39K were eventually replaced by modern humans. Here are 8 models of possible causation from the least likely to the most likely. Early modern human alliance with wolves, dogs, resulting in domination of the food chain. Problem with this theory, which was espoused by Eric Trinkhouse's wife, Shipman, was that modern human DNA, dog DNA, only begins to show up at around 16K, just 20,000 years after they disappeared, okay? So not a very good theory. The idea of volcanic eruptions, Mount Tuba and the Campanian volcanic eruption in Italy, nobody buys it, basically. Genocide, intergroup violence, Neanderthals were killed off by modern humans, localized quarrels for food or territory, a la what happened with Europeans coming to America and what happened to Native Americans. We'll come back to part of that idea, but not many espouse this theory anymore, basically. The spread of modern human pathogens to Neanderthals. So we got Neanderthal immune genes in Europe. What did they get from us? So that we may have basically ended up spreading our diseases in a similar scenario to 90% of Native Americans being exterminated by European diseases, okay? After COVID, this becomes potentially a more interesting theory, okay? Because COVID doesn't leave any skeletal marks, basically. We would never know that some sapiens virus couldn't have impacted the very small Neanderthal groups that happened. So that may have been part of the process. We may never know, basically, unless some amazing new technology occurs. One wilder theory by Schiarelli in 2004, he came up with the idea that Neanderthals were pushed into extinction by prion diseases like Kuru and mad cow disease that they contracted by feeding on the brains of their own dead. Okay, we know that they did do that occasionally, but I haven't seen any convincing data that this occurred. The idea that there was resource competition and that Neanderthals were outcompeted by sapiens, that there were local quarrels for food and territory, potential violence by sapiens, competitive replacement, or the idea of competitive exclusion is when two species competing for the same limited resource can't coexist, and that one of them is going to end up predominant. I haven't seen this one referenced very much, basically. Climactic stress. Almost certainly, this was part of the picture. Okay, habitat degradation, fragmentation occurred in Neanderthal territory in the 10K before the arrival of sapiens. Large game dying out, effective population sizes decreasing. Some of the more intriguing uncertainties that remain include where the splitting, dispersing, perhaps replacements visible in the Neanderthal metapopulation that began occurring, that there were clear divisions going on within the Neanderthals that ended up leading to genetic differences that we've described earlier. So climactic impact is a possibility. Rapid temperature rise towards a hothouse Eemian peak, followed by a world in flux, experiencing massive temperature jumps, 11 to 16 centigrade. Population changes are mirrored in the archaeology with the proliferation of techno complexes and regional traditions between 120 and 40K that changed for Neanderthals. Finlayson from Gibraltar argues that climate was really a big factor, but some of his ideas have gotten a little worn, basically. Rag Sykes comments that Neanderthals disliked full-scale glacials, but was the climate during the last few millennia up to 40K worse than what they'd weathered before. While true tundra species do become more common at the end of the Middle Paleolithic, they only really dominate after the last Neanderthals have actually disappeared. Perhaps it wasn't intense cold, but maybe the wider impact that made it somewhat different. While hunter-gatherers can successfully adapt to extremes, instability can be catastrophic. And during the last period, there was an incredibly substantial frenzy of cycles going on from 55K on, basically, and sometimes plunging from not too bad to truly bitter within a single lifetime. So they were enduring some incredibly fluctuating bad climate change that was going on. But doesn't mean the Neanderthals lived in permanent crisis. Consistent uncertainty would have amped up the risk, and this is visible in their core prey species. Horse and mammoth were being forced to rapidly alter their diet, or probably behaving in new ways that may have impacted hunting tactics. Yet climate chaos can't be the full story. What happened to hyenas during that crucial period is interesting. They were even more affected than the Neanderthals by the huge decline in prey during this glaciation, but recovered from the crash in the warmish conditions afterwards, and steep tundra and even open forests loaded with herbivores developed again. Neanderthals mirrored this, expanding as things warmed up, even recolonizing Britain and revealing a burst of technological diversity. But unfortunately, this golden age didn't last. Genetic evidence of a possible bottleneck and archaeological records both suggest population fragmentation and possibly even local extinctions occurred in Northern Europe at around 74K due to glacial effects. And when climate got better, previously abandoned regions became repopulated in Britain, which had not seen any Neanderthal occupations for almost 10,000 years. Then, however, following a warm, stable phase lasting several thousand years, it degenerated into this highly fluctuating climate excursions that may have been part of what messed everybody up during that period. This article entitled "Living on the Edge Was Demographic Weakness, the Cause of Neanderthal Demise," indicates that a population of 5,000 is the lowest the species can have to survive, and that a female birth rate is the crucial variable. If the rate gets below 0.13, your species disappears in 4K. So basically, you hit that delivery rate and you disappear within 4,000 years. And they're postulating basically that this is part of probably what happened to the Neanderthals, basically. So this gets into population dynamics that, in effect, Neanderthals did their own demise by themselves. Their population was simply too small, too much family that should be inbreeding, with a decline in genetic diversity, reduced fertility. Population size absolutely matters for the survival of the species. Even Charles Darwin pointed out that large population size is a hedge bet against extinction. Chris Stringer said that they may have disappeared in different regions for different reasons, but the background cause is clear. They simply didn't have the numbers. Phases of presence and absence of Neanderthals in the late Pleistocene. Repeated phases of colonization, regional extinction, recolonization during earlier glacial, interglacial cycles. And this paid dearly in terms of their genetics, basically, that genetic variability basically continued toward crashing. Remember, their genetic variability was the equivalent of modern mountain gorillas, which are an endangered species, basically. So late Neanderthal populations had small effective population size and were inbred. This study basically showed at Denisova low population number with interbreeding. They found that genetically this group here, from a woman's toe bone, that they were at the level of half siblings, grandfather to granddaughter, aunt, nephew, double first cousin kinds of levels, basically. And at 49K, Neanderthal family at El Cedron in Spain showed vast evidence of inbreeding, basically. That this sort of represented the beginning of the demographic collapse of this group. Stephen Churchill was the one that coined the phrase "thin on the ground," that basically Neanderthals had relatively low population densities throughout their existence. Larger population size correlates with technical innovation. The smaller your group, the less innovation you're going to produce, basically. Their energetic and ecological factors kept Neanderthals at low population density throughout their existence. So they tended to live in groups of 15 to 30, some estimates of 1 person per 40 square miles. Total populations have been estimated from anywhere from 5 to 70,000 over their lifespan. And genetic studies show very small effective population sizes, eventually familial interbreeding. 80% of all known Neanderthal appear to have died as young adults, implying small population size per square kilometer. And early modern human populations were probably an order of magnitude larger than the Neanderthals. So small population is not good for survival, basically. And with small populations, you get more genetic drift, more possibility of recessive genes, etc. So Chris Stringer, there was nothing inevitable about modern human success. It was pure luck, basically. it could have gone either way. They could have disappeared and we survived, or vice versa, basically. Last theory, genetic assimilation. So interbreeding and hybridization with modern humans. That basically Neanderthals were genetically absorbed into Homo sapiens without significant genetic contribution to modern populations. So interbred with anatomically modern humans, the Awasi hybrid as an example. And this is an example of extinction by hybridization. Genetic swamping is a well-known extinction cause among plant and animal species. A smallish group of native trout, as an example, may lose their genetic identity after a large influx of different species, which the native fish can breed with, and they basically disappear. So extinction by hybridization. And over generations of genetic mixing, the Neanderthal genome would simply begin to disappear, as it has, basically. Fred Smith was the first one to propose this model, basically, of extinction by hybridization or assimilation. And Pablo has also, I think, agreed with this model, basically. Let's say today we have 1 to 6% of Neanderthal DNA. Low levels of interbreeding suggest that either archaic people mated with moderns only rarely, or their hybrid offspring had low fitness. Reich notes that 90% of our genomes are inherited from African ancestors who replaced archaic people all over the place. So this scenario really matches the assimilation models proposed by Smith and also the German Brouwer. So Vella and Robrutz in 2014 basically said this was a complex process that resulted from a stochastic process with multiple factors. You've got repeated population crashes with decreased genetic diversity, low Neanderthal population density, interbreeding with some cultural contact, possible male hybrid sterility, contraction, geographic distribution, followed by genetic swapping and assimilation by modern human immigrants. No significant data supports the supposed technological, social, or cognitive inferiority of Neanderthals, okay? And single factor explanations for their disappearance probably aren't warranted anymore. Their demise was clearly more complex than many archaeological based scenarios of cognitive inferiority seem to suggest. And that the Neanderthal archaeological record wasn't different enough to explain their denouement in terms of some kind of inferiority in anything that's archaeologically visible. So if they weren't disadvantaged, then why didn't they survive? And the draft genome of us basically shows that, in fact, they did in 1 to 2% increments, basically. So there's more Neanderthal DNA today in modern humans than there was in the entire period when they were alive as a species. And so they did okay in terms of their gene flow. So in sum, interbreeding and assimilation are now supported by genetic data. Reich Sykes says, however we conceptualize it, the vanishing of Neanderthals has loomed golem-like over virtually every aspect of how we've researched, portrayed, and dreamed of them. Narratives of their failure and our success have dominated. There is no obvious or simple answer for why we are here and not them. If you look at their bodies, little evidence for specific physical features that gave us dramatic advantage. We both ate mammoth, etc. Both Neanderthals and hyenas came under pressure from declines in prey at MIS3 as it got colder. The carnivores hung on with their tenacious jaws along with cave bears in southwestern Europe until about 31K. In contrast, Neanderthals who had previously outcompeted them never made it past 40K. So at least some Neanderthal groups included elders who acted as sources of disaster mitigation. But if the situation deteriorated beyond the common knowledge, fleeing might have been the only option for survival. And if southern lands were already filled with Neanderthals or humans, then those from the north wouldn't have any refuge, basically. The added factor that no previous generation had encountered in large numbers was Homo sapiens. So they clearly encountered, they interbred, and Sykes wonders if contagion couldn't have been part of this algorithm, basically, that given what we know about COVID, et cetera, the Black Plague, who knows? So for all their cleverness, flexibility, and resilience, the archaeology does suggest they had weaker and smaller social networks made up of small groups that rarely came together in large groupings. Climate meltdown, perfect storm of stressors, basically, may have been overwhelming. But the fact that hybrids existed, lived, loved, and raised their own children is the most pervasive argument for our closeness at every level. Not only did we find each other attractive, but some level of cultural communication must have been involved. Fundamentally, the long obsession over the Neanderthals' fate reflects our deep dread of annihilation. Extinction is frightening for any group, and in the face of obliteration, we desire comforting parables where we are always the ones who live. What's more, we want to feel special. Most of the stories we've told about Neanderthals have been narcissistic reassurances that we won because we're outstanding, destined to survive. Climate change today may be comments about that possibility. Neanderthals were never some sort of highway service station en route to real people. They were state-of-the-art humans, just of a different sort. Clearly Neanderthals were not inferior to humans. And one of the questions is, why did it take so long for sapiens to replace Neanderthals? It's hard to square the narratives of repeated contact and reproduction with the archaeological record of Neanderthals' sudden demise, but their distinctive skeletal morphological features basically disappear at 40K. And this is the tantamount to an almost simultaneous vanishing across their entire geographic range, although we don't know the specifics. Homo sapiens weren't their executioners so much as their assimilators. And probably genetic drift operating in small populations may explain the absence of Neanderthal mitochondrial and Y chromosome in the modern gene pools, basically. And they were swamped, basically, by this new group. A 2% demographic advantage in early moderns compared with the Neanderthals would have led to the latter's extinction in 30 generations, or about 800 years, is my estimate. And some authors have proposed that the cultural explosion of the Upper Paleolithic was a function of greater population density of modern humans. And the difference in terms of population sizes New diseases may have been a factor, like Native Americans. And remember that many of these diseases killed Native Americans so quickly that there was no skeletal evidence, and diseases were introduced could have had similar catastrophic outcome for Neanderthals as well. So most likely a simulation as being the answer for Neanderthal extinction, and let's say, okay, I'm going to skip a little. Sykes comments, Neanderthals had lived through many periods of extreme climate change. The conditions around 55K became extraordinarily unstable. If sapiens had been marginal advantages in coping with this instability, then over time that would have built up. And a few human babies surviving per year could eventually snowball into a total population replacement if Neanderthal genes were being diluted by breeding with us. Their fate wasn't a dramatic annihilation, but a slow, irreversible assimilation. But there was clearly no chasm between us, basically. So we'll wait for Ludovic Slimac's new book. He tends to be a little more differential between sapiens and Neanderthal from the take I've had. We'll obviously talk about it when we get to him. Others have said, what I have been telling people is that it was like a Game of Thrones. There were a few spread out populations, some related, some not, immigrating or going extinct over time, and winter was always coming. Pablo has said he recommends against imagining separate species of human evolution altogether, not an us or a them, but one enormous meta population composed of shifting clusters of humans that periodically coincided in time and space, and when they happened to bump into occasionally, ending up having sex. Finlayson said each valley could have told the different stories. In one, they may have hit each other over the head. In another, they may have made love. In another, they simply ignored each other. Another, a super long elevator ride with strangers. Can we say that Neanderthals were less than fully human? Okay. There are lots of novels about Neanderthals if you're interested. The best sci-fi ones is a trilogy by Robert Sawyer. We've had everybody from Asimov to William Golding, The Inheritors, even Bill Shatner tried one. Basically, among the best is Owls, the Clan of the Cave Bear, of course. So, films, Quest for Fire, etc. Planet of the Cave Bear, 13th Warrior. Documentaries out there from BBC. Decoding the Neanderthals is pretty good from a Nova series. There's a whole Neanderthal tourism in terms of visitor sites at all of the most famous La Chapelle, Le Mosier, out of work at Capina, the Neanderthal Valley, the Hall of Human Origins. All of the John Gurche reconstructions are at the Smithsonian. And in terms of Neanderthal bibliography, next year will come out the latest, The Naked Neanderthal by Slimak. Kindred is the most recent. Lots of good reads out there, basically. Going back to Stringer, Tattersall has one, etc. So that's the end of our little series. Okay. Everything I've been able to collect on Neanderthals. And I think you've got almost all of the data that's mostly out there in terms of our close cousins there. So,
Thank you.
This is great.
all right.
One thing,
So
one
we
thing
have
I did
something
recently-
else to talk about. I'll see some of you on Wednesday. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.